It's an absolute pleasure to have Benjamin Smith here at UCLA. He's a prominent historian of Mexico. I'm going to read a little bit of your bio, sorry. He obtained his PhD from Cambridge University in 2006. He taught for 7 years at Michigan State University. And then he also taught at, move on and taught at University of Warwick, where he's currently teaching since 2016 and has become a prominent professor of Latin American studies since 2019. Benjamin T. Smith has written about Mexico for more than 2 decades, so he knows the country upside down. He's a historian of the 19th century with a focus mostly on the 20th century. He knows indigenous Mexico, he knows urban Mexico, he knows the provinces, but he developed an inclination, let's put it like that, for Oaxaca. And he wrote 2 books on Oaxaca, the southern state in Mexico. He then moved on to study the relationship between the Mexican state and the press, with an emphasis not only on Mexico City, which is sometimes problematic in the literature, but also trying to focus on the provinces, on Oaxaca and Chihuahua in particular. And he also focuses on Catholics, but not the hierarchies, but the grassroots Catholics that also, in a way, have a very complicated, let's put it like that, relationship with the Mexican liberal state, and then later with the post-revolutionary state. So he has a deep knowledge, a profound knowledge of Mexico and Mexicans. He has written 4 books and edited a number of other volumes with other people. So he is truly one of the people that we appreciate having in the Mexican, as a Mexicanist in general. So it's a true pleasure to have Ben here. And the format of this talk is it's not like most talks. It's we're going to try to have a conversation. So I'm going to have Ben to discuss his book. But before we do that, I would like to ask Ben how essentially you developed this relationship with Mexico and Mexicans. What brought you in the first place to Mexico, to study Mexico? And can you give us a little bit of background on how you developed this relationship with this country?
Well, short and flippantly, I got married to a Mixteca. But more broadly, so I think late 1990s, as a kind of, I suppose, putative leftist with an interesting kind of popular movements, Mexico was an unbelievably kind of romantic country to go to. It had the Zapatistas were kind of linking up old school Marxism with new identity politics in this really, really exciting way. And I thought that what the Zapatistas, a group of Mayan insurgents, needed was a slightly chubby British man with virtually no journalistic training and very poor Spanish. Oddly, I found out they didn't need that. So I basically hung around southern Mexico for a year, partially teaching English, attempting to write journalism. I found out I was working as a kind of stringer for the Financial Times. I found out the Financial Times was not enormously interested in my profound discussion of indigenous politics. I remember I was sent there once to write on some kind of petroleum gasoline line that was being built through Chiapas. And I wrote this thing, oh, there's lots of problems with land and there's lots of problems with, territory. They gave me 2 lines which said gas line runs through Chiapas, causes some problems. Anyway, so I was a completely unsuccessful journalist, but I did meet a large amount of Mexican people who fell in love with the place, and particularly the kind of, I suppose, the indigenous politics. I was lucky enough to be welcomed into a large, slightly intimidating Mexican family, mostly from the Mixteca. Gaspar knows quite how intimidating these families can be, and got married, went back to Cambridge, and rejected doing British history, which I'd been asked. Well, I'd got a place at Cambridge, and instead said I was going to do 17th century British history. Where would that have got me? And instead changed to kind of 19th, 20th century Mexican history. At that point, they didn't even have a person teaching Mexican history. They had to get one out of retirement. A guy called David Braden, very sadly, was my mentor. He passed away strangely yesterday. So he's kind of on my mind. But yeah, he was the guy who trained me and really got me interested in both in kind of indigenous politics, territory, religiosity. Yeah, he was the kind of guy who guided me on my way. Now I've gone in different directions, though, maybe.
So for those of you who do not know David Braden, he is a towering figure in Mexican historiography. He wrote about colonial Mexico. He wrote about merchants and El Bajío and the silver economy. And then later on, he moved and had a massive book on Creoles and patriots in New Spain, and then early Mexican politics. So he's a towering figure in Mexican historiography. And David Braden is part of this small but very brilliant lot of British historians who somehow found an interest in Mexico, together with Alan Knight, for instance, or Hammett. And then Ben is part of that other generation, together with not only British historians, but historians of Mexico that are based in the UK, like Timo Schaffer and then Helga Beideman. And so a brilliant group of historians of Mexico that are based in the UK that have helped us to illuminate the history of this country. So you're part of that. And then sadly, yes, David Braden passed recently. But to sort of build on that, so you eventually developed a very strong scholarship on Mexico and Mexicans. You wrote about, your first book is about Oaxaca, but it's mostly a book on the political system in Mexico as it developed after the Mexican Revolution in the 40s, in the 50s, and you're part of that generation that was not sort of okay with this idea that the one-party system was completely dominant and completely monopolized politics in Mexico. You wanted to take a more grassroots take on Mexican politics and understand indigenous organizations, grassroots organizations, how they connected to caciques, to political bosses, but also to the governor, and how the state of Oaxaca relates to the federal government in Mexico. So these are complicated things. And he wrote an amazing book breaking down the different relationships that all of these political actors in Mexico had in the mid-20th century. And then he wrote a book on the Mixteca Baja, which is also in Oaxaca, on indigenous politics through the relationship that they had with the church and the state, and equally emphasizing the agency, if you will, of everyday Mexicans, in this case, people from the Mixteca, and how they interact with this mythology, if you will, of the one-party system and the top-down politics of Mexico. And lastly, he wrote a book on the Mexican press. I majored in communication studies, so I would, of course, be interested in learning about the Mexican press in the 20th century. And what we learned when we were at UNAM, they taught us about the relationship between the press and the Mexican state. But it was also a narrative of very straightforward top-down relationships between the press and the state, with the state being monopolizing the conversation. The press did not have, according to this narrative, a lot of latitude. But Ben painted a different picture, a picture in which the journalists and the press had a lot of latitude. They negotiated with the state. They were part at some point of the political system, but they also criticized the system. Now, all of this is only to say that he is a historian of the Mexican political system. He understands very clearly what not many people outside of Mexico understands. all of that is to ask you how these three books, your understanding of the Mexican political system in the 20th century, how that informed the writing of this book, because this book, the Dope, is also a political history of Mexico.
Yeah, certainly. So I suppose two things that I really kind of transferred over. One was that when I was studying the Mexican state in the 20th century, in the late 90s, early 2000s, there seemed to be a tendency, particularly among certain US scholars, to ignore the levels of violence that the state had meted out towards indigenous groups, but also groups that they deemed to be criminals, whether they be like weed growers or sex workers. So that was one thing that I kind of wanted to continue to look at, and I felt that the historiography had ignored. The other thing that I was really interested in was the way that often both historians, but also journalists, political commentators continually basically discuss the relationship between any kind of criminal entity and the state in Mexico as corruption, right? And it's the same kind of discourse that we have now, particularly in the United States. The problem is south of the border, there's just complete corruption. And that's right, I've just been interviewing DEA agents and former cops, and that's all they say. And from my experience and kind of understanding of Mexico, it wasn't corruption any kind of meaning in the same way that people were defining corruption. Corruption, the standard political science definition, is taking public money for private good, right? Taking your and my tax dollars, right, tax pounds, and using them to buy your luxurious house or your kind of yacht. Think current Tory government, right? That wasn't what was going on in Mexico, right? In Mexico, people in the authorities, policemen, governors, were taking actually private money, the money of drug traffickers, not to prosecute them. And they were no doubt using this money for luxurious houses. Famously, the police chief of Mexico City built a kind of scale model of the Parthenon in Zihuatanejo beach resort. But it wasn't all like that. They were building schools, they were building roads, they were putting this money towards the construction of the state. So I suppose those were the kind of two key things, both manipulation of violence, use of violence, I suppose the kind of culture of violence, although that's a problematic term, I know, and kind of corruption, the relation between the state and what were deemed to be criminals, but were often actually helping to build the state.
So the relationship between what we now see as cartels or criminals and the state was more complicated than we thought, right?
Well, so I mean, cartels themselves, what's fascinating, I've now kind of become a kind of, I suppose, amateur criminologist. I've been reading about the mafia and the triads and the Yakuza in Japan. And what's fascinating is each of these kind of organized crime groups have their own kind of unique culture. In Mexico's, depressingly, the unique culture of the cartels is that they are rooted in the state. The terminology about the first cartel heads were not actually people like Caro Quintero and Fonseca that you see on the news. They were cops. They were cops that had previously been tracking down drug traffickers and taking money from them, and then got sacked or just left and became basically independent traffickers. A lot of the terminology, the term plaza, which is the area of geography that a cartel controls, that's the term that the federal cops used to use. The term derecho de piso, which is basically extortion money that cartels charge, is actually a term for taxation that market sellers had to pay the government. So, I mean, even when you see the Italian mafia, the terminology comes from kind of basically rural Sicilian agriculture, right, or Sicilian peasant villages. The language of the Mexican cartels comes directly from the state, and it's which I found absolutely kind of fascinating. It's something I think fairly unique in the history of organized crime.
So then, can you walk us through the narrative arc of the book? Because one of the important things that I think this book does is that it really makes it clear that what we now perceive as this unhinged violence and disaster was not really the case for the most part of the drug trade, that the drug trade did not necessarily involve massive violence or conflict. So can you walk us through the narrative arc? Where do you start? how do you, what's your take on the early drug trade?
Yeah, certainly. So I suppose the first thing to come to mind, or the first thing that I should say, is that the drug trade in Mexico is entirely, Mexico does not have, and has never really had until the last 10, 15 years, a kind of what you might call an indigenous drug taking culture beyond certain indigenous groups that have taken certain psychedelics. Basically, there was a very, very limited market in marijuana. There was no market in heroin. So what Mexico produces and its entire drug industry is dependent on demand in the United States. America gets the itch, Mexico provides. So it was really, for the first half century of the 20th century, Mexico was an incredibly small producer of drugs. It had kind of little bohemian corners where people smoked weed, but basically it was incredibly small scale. There's a kind of boom in the 1940s because the US gets cut off from its heroin supply during World War II. And interestingly, these areas where they start to grow opium poppies, they're the same places they grow opium poppies now, right? People like Chapo that I'm sure you've seen on the news, they are 4th-generation opium poppy growers, right? So these were the same areas that are places like Badia de Guato, where they still are, drug traffickers are extremely powerful then. So first, one of the key things is demand. And demand doesn't really get going until the 1960s. And the counterculture changes everything. What we think is the fairly kind of groovy US demand for weed that we nowadays kind of heroize, right? It was like an oil boom in the United States. It suddenly meant that it wasn't just a few places in Sinaloa that are growing drugs. It's vast swathes of Sierra Mexico, Michoacan, your place, Guerrero, Oaxaca, everyone's growing it. So that kind of completely changed. So demand is key. The second, I suppose, story is that up to the 1970s, and maybe even up to the 1990s, the trade is incredibly pacific, right? Compared to the violence in Mexico connected to land, to unions, or to religion, there's virtually no violence connected to the drug trade. Partly it's because the trade's pretty small, but mostly it's for two reasons. One, all of these drug traffickers are interrelated, right? They're friends. They're friends, they're family members, they get married, they're compadres. So that's one kind of key reason. You see again and again, they go like, why would I, okay, my compadre stole a kilo of heroin. I'm not going to kill him for that, right? He's married to my sister. I mean, there's an enormous amount. There's a kind of there's a very close connections. The second thing is the state is very careful to control the drug trade. It realizes the US, if it sees there is the US can see where there is violence and will focus its kind of eye of Sauron, the Lord of the Rings fans, on areas of kind of drug-related violence. So the state tried to kind of minimize it, again, pretty much up to the 1970s. So as I say, there were incredibly occasional outbreaks of violence connected to the drug trade. And if there were, these weren't beefs between drug traffickers. Mostly, these were beefs between state officials, mostly cops, and drug traffickers. And they weren't over drug traffickers not wanting to traffic. They were normally over drug traffickers not wanting to pay protection money to the state, not wanting to pay bribes. So occasionally the state went, oh, you're not going to pay us 30% of your profits. Okay, we'll get rid of you and put some more people in your place. So occasionally get that, but that's barely once a decade. And it's maybe 10, 20 people killed. So this is small scale compared to the other political violence going on in Mexico.
So the violence did not come from different criminal organizations fighting against each other until very recently. It came mostly because the state intervened to provide protection. Let's put it like that. Can you explain a little bit that aspect of the book? Ben talks a lot about protection rackets, and it is these protection rackets that actually triggered periodic violence in the drug trade until recently.
Yeah, so I suppose kind of my my revelations. I read this book, brilliant book by Gambetti about the Sicilian mafia, and he says, "What does the mafia do in Italy? It effectively sells protection, right? It sells protection. Initially, it sold protection because there wasn't much of a state for your kind of legal products. In Sicily, it happened to be lemons and limes that they were selling in the late 19th century. By the 20th century, they sell protection to criminals for smuggling enterprises, sex trafficking, gambling, untaxed cigarettes, basically anything illegal. The mafia sells protection for it, right? You pay a bit of your profits to the mafia, and the mafia basically promise you're not going to get busted by the cops. In Mexico, it was the state that did that. The state basically go to the traffickers and go, if you don't want to go to prison, you pay us a cut of your profits. Okay, so and it was that revelation that seeing the relationship between the state and that, not just dismissing it as kind of corruption, but seeing it as a protection racket, because this led me to other things. So, for example, what happens when you're a policeman and the local drug trafficker doesn't want to pay you bribes? Well, just like the mafia, you don't put him in prison because that's completely you. You're not going to get any money out of a guy in prison, right? So what do? You basically lean on him, just like the Italian mafia did. You kidnap him, you torture him, and you extract money from him, right? If he doesn't then pay for, and if he doesn't pay you the money, then you get rid of him. You get rid of him, or you kill him, or you put him in prison. You say to the Americans, "Look, I put a guy in prison. Aren't I a fantastic cop?" And then you just go and put a drug dealer who will pay you 30% of his profits in his place. And you see that happening again and again in Mexico, and frankly, happening like that today. So this kind of idea of the state running these protection rackets, just like the Italian mafia, was, well, I suppose that was my kind of revelation. And I think it's. I mean, if we were going to get too technical, I think two things I think we have to learn as 20th century historians is, one, to look at contemporary criminology, which we don't look at all. And the second thing is to look at some of the methods of journalism, which is where I got so many of these stories. So that's my kind of methodology bit.
So that's the other. Well, it has many virtues, the book, but one of the many virtues that this book has is that it reads very easily. It's a book that it's full of stories, of anecdotes that then have meaning to understand beyond concepts, beyond terms and complicated jargon. Through anecdotes, the dope tells the story of these protection rackets, and then he names names. He has the last names of the police forces, the police, the cops that are involved in the trade, but also he has the last names of the families that are involved in the early drug trade, right? So what I would also like here to sort of emphasize, and if you could elaborate a little bit, is what is the role of the U.S. in the early drug trade, in also, in a way, stimulating these protection rackets? What's the role of the DEA and all of these U.S.-based agencies in the drug trade?
So, I mean, there are two big kind of U.S. agencies that really interfere in the Mexican attempt to kind of police the Mexican drug trade. The first is something called the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which runs from 1930 to 1968, which is run by a guy called Harry Anslinger, who is like Hoover, but not in a dress. And he kind of touts himself as the world expert on drugs. He's pretty much the guy who implements the kind of international counter narcotics policy everywhere, right? Everyone has to start to ban drugs. So there are times in Mexico where they do. One extraordinary doctor, a guy called Salazar Vinegra in 1940, tries to legalize weed. Then he does manage to legalize morphine, giving out morphine to addicts. It's a revelation. It basically puts all the drug dealers out of business. It's extremely successful. It kind of looks a bit grotty because you get lots of heroin users who are outside these kind of state-run clinics in the middle of Mexico City, but it does work. And it's Anslinger and the FBN that basically say, if you continue that, for some reason, Anslinger has control of the US's morphine exports. and it says, if you're going to continue with this experiment, we're not going to export morphine. So all of your cancer patients are going to die in pain. So the Mexicans have to back out of that. So occasionally the Americans play the role, I suppose, of bad cop, the stick, right? Don't experiment with drug policy, keep banning it, okay? The second big intervention they have is in the 1970s, post-Nixon. I think it's often, and I'm sure many of you have learned about, actually, we've got some great scholars of it here, about mass incarceration. And there's a kind of common assumption that it starts with Nixon's kind of war on drugs. But in actual fact, Nixon's war on drugs doesn't put that many people in prison. The fundamental reason being that the vast majority of people who come back addicted to heroin are white soldiers from Vietnam, and he doesn't really want to put those in prison. So in actual fact, he just sets up some quite far-reaching treatment for that. What he does do is he wages a war on drugs in foreign countries, right? And he starts this kind of very aggressive war on drugs in Mexico, basically through a series of kind of, I won't go into them too much, but diplomatic blackmails. He forces Mexico to crack down on the drug trade. And it does so pretty much like it would crack down on a guerrilla insurgency. It's more like a kind of counter-insurgency campaign. It's violent. It involves about 10,000 army people. It involves a kind of newly invigorated federal police. It involves absolutely brutal forms of torture, where we're still wondering quite whether they're getting it from the counterinsurgency people, or in actual fact, the counterinsurgency people, I suspect more and more, are getting it from the drug cops. It's extremely violent. It causes, I mean, the current Truth Commission, I'm very happy to talk about this, which is running in Mexico. It's Mexico's fourth Truth Commission. I'm not sure how successful it'll be, but one of the things that it's doing that is very interesting is seeing the dirty war in Mexico, that is the Cold War kind of counterinsurgency war, not as just killing left-wing guerrillas, but also killing, you know, drug-growing peasants and dropping them out of helicopters into the ocean. I mean, really violent stuff. So, and America is behind that. America is forcing Mexico and is strictly, if you're a DEA officer and you see a Mexican cop do anything violent, you're meant to report it immediately. The DEA never reported anything, and yet talking to lots of former DEA agents, they definitely saw it. They knew it was going on. They got all their information from torture and violence, basically. They were utterly complicit in it. So those are, I suppose, the two, 1940 and the 1970s, the two kind of key historical moments when the US intervenes.
And can you tell us a little bit about the relationship between different US agencies operating in Mexico and contradicting each other? Sometimes the FBI contradicts the DEA, sometimes the DEA goes its own way. So can you tell us a little bit about the contradictions within the US?
Well, I think certainly from a Mexican perspective, you tend to say they're all gabachos, right? They're all gringos. No, you kind of look at these people who are into your country and you just assume that they're all singing from the same song sheet. But one thing I found is the amount of tensions between different institutions that are operating in Mexico. State Department hates the DEA, thinks they're a bunch of basically thick cop punks. They hate the FBI. The DEA hates the FBI because they think they're all a bunch of suits, like Harvard educated, you know. So the real kind of interesting kind of class tensions, right? The DEA itself is split between what we call the agents, the people on the ground, and the so-called suits, who have to be kind of better educated. I mean, you know, so all of these different, the CIA, we'll get into this, is, I mean, the DEA and the CIA loathe one another. CIA is at best happy to turn a blind eye to drug trafficking if it's done by its people, people that are basically killing communists. The DEA doesn't like that, although some of the DEA are former CIA, so they don't mind it so much. So it's, as I say, the American, I think that's one thing that the Mexicans describe working with the Americans as like a shell game, right? You basically, you work out which institution is going to do what you want to do. Right. So you give, let's say you're a Mexican federal cop and you want to take down this trafficker. You go and say that to 4 different US institutions and you'll see which one bites. Right. Because 3 of them just won't want to do it. It's not worth our time. The State Department's telling us not to interfere. and then you might get somebody who will do it. Maybe he's FBI, maybe he's DEA, maybe he's CIA, right? I mean, recent taking down of a Video Guzman, that was CIA, because the military works with the CIA, right? So, as I say, these are, interestingly, the Americans also treat the Mexican institutions like a shell game. They go, right, we want to go after Chapo. Right, let's say that to 4 institutes: Army, Marines, federal cops, state cops. 3 of those will be informing for Chapo, but 1 of them won't. And then you work with them. But in doing this, you often like lose informants. I mean, it's what amazed me is how unthought out, how chaotic a lot of this is.
And can you give us an example of, for instance, when things go wrong? I'm thinking of the Camarena case, for instance, where
Did that go? I mean, I'm not sure if that did go wrong for the Americans, right? The DEA, 1985. I mean, I'm sure you've seen Narcos or heard of Narcos. Camarena, DEA agent gets. We're not quite sure why. Possibly he angers some drug traffickers by finding some weed fields. Possibly he gets forfeited some of their money. Again, possibly he finds out these drug traffickers are working with the CIA, trafficking cocaine in order to pay for the Contras in Nicaragua. Frankly, I'm not sure we're ever going to know. I mean, the Camarena murder is the JFK murder of the drug trade, right? It's the kind of. So what this means, however, is once this guy gets killed, he gets killed very brutally. He's tortured. I mean, one thing I will say is thousands of Mexicans have been tortured in that way, but this is a DEA agent. So the DEA and the American government go in incredibly hard, and often illegally kidnapping people, throwing people out, literally throwing people through the fence from Tijuana into San Diego. It's brutal. What it does do is it pretty much saves the DEA. The DEA is a totally dysfunctional institution. Mid-1980s, even Reagan is thinking of getting rid of the DEA because they're so incompetent. The DEA at that time runs its head office is sitting above a strip joint in DC, right? I'm not joking. The FBI comes in there in like 1982 and 3. There's an FBI person who's put in charge of the DEA because it's so dysfunctional, and goes like, you really cannot hold meetings in a strip club, guys. And eventually, by 1989, they move it to the Pentagon. They lose the entire archive, allegedly. I mean, there's nothing in. If you go to Nara, if you go to College Park, right? Yeah, the U.S. National Archives. You go, can I have a look at the DEA stuff? Everyone will like kind of do this kind of massive eye roll, like ojo de huevo, like and they'll be like, oh, DEA never give us anything. They've got like literally 2 training manuals. 2 tiny little, that's all the DEA has. I mean, it's a complete scandal that no one will reveal. So anyway, I've got off topic there, but yeah, the DEA is I think it's more competent now, maybe.
But you were not off topic in the sense that we have this narrative of U.S. agencies that are successful and competent, and they know what they're doing, but most of the time they really don't know what they're doing, and they're triggering and making problems bigger.
Yeah, they have no idea. These guys have no understanding of the political system. Actually, I was talking to a guy yesterday who was, I mean, in actual fact, to give this guy his due, he was a former probation officer down in San Diego who got pulled into an anti-cartel task force. So he understood gangs, particularly in kind of South San Diego, kind of bits of Tijuana as well. He wasn't daft. But even he said, like, yeah, for 10 years, I had no understanding of the kind of political ramifications. You arrest this guy, right? You arrest this drug trafficker in Tijuana. You don't realize you're kind of humiliating his political protection. He then goes after the political protection, going, why don't you protect me? Why have these Americans gone and arrested me? Then the cartel goes after, gets very worried it's got an informant. It probably does. So then it goes and whacks loads of random people it doesn't trust. I mean, it's really obvious that they don't understand the kind of the ripple effect that these kind of what look like good policies on the US side, which we can stick in the San Diego Union and go, look, we caught a guy, he was horrible. And then the one thing the Mexicans really got angry about is they would go and extradite some horrible drug trafficker, and the Americans will go, he's a dreadful drug trafficker, he trafficked loads of drugs, but he's also kind of cooperating with us to take down some other guy. So we'll give him about 20 years. So this is a guy who's probably ordered 200, 300 deaths in Mexico. And the Mexicans are going, okay, we've given him to you. And he's getting out in what? He gets 20 years, he gets out in 12. Yeah. So this year, 2 years' time, Benjamin Arellano Felix will get released, who was the Arellano Felix Tijuana cartel leader, right? This year, Ociel Cardenas, the guy who invents the Zetas, is getting released, right? I mean, the Americans don't talk about that, right? Guido Parma, who was kind of Chapo's right-hand man, he was released quite recently, but he was also working with the Mexican mafia. I mean, it's like in the jail when he was there. So, yeah, they have the Mexicans are trying to bring down the murder rate. The Americans are trying to make flashy busts, basically, and those two things don't correlate.
Yeah. And then there are other passages in the book where Ben discusses how the Mexican police and even the military are very effective at actually cracking down on these criminal organizations. But the problem is that there is this functionality between the US and the Mexican authorities that makes things even more complicated for, in general, Mexicans, ordinary Mexicans.
I mean, this is something, and I would encourage you, if you are interested in the subject, there was an amazing book that just came out called Fear is Just a Word, which follows a woman who, it's an incredibly tragic story. Her daughter got kidnapped by the Zetas in kind of 2010, gets killed, and she's a kind of market woman, and she decides, right, I'm going to pursue these Zetas who killed my daughter. And she literally does. I mean, she literally tracks them down, gets on kind of, she becomes a kind of expert on tracing them all on Facebook, but she also goes undercover into kind of some border, slums. She kind of armed all the time. And then she teams up with the military, because the military are going after the Zetas. And she just, I mean, this is part of the book where she basically says, right, okay, I've tracked down these Zetas. I think they were responsible for kidnapping my daughter. So the military just capture them, just go, caught it. They run away and shoots them in the back. And his estimate, and this is from the military, is they killed 2,000 Zetas in cold blood. I'm not here to defend the Zetas. They are a ruthless and unpleasant organized crime group. But the military had a shoot to kill policy, as did the Marines, against certain organized crime groups. So they've always, the military is a dreadful policing organization, but it's a fairly efficient counterinsurgency. Yeah.
But all of this is to say that none of this has to do with the drug trade intrinsically, really. It's not about the drugs. It's about these arrangements between different police forces in the two countries. So that creates the conditions for violence to erupt. The drug trade, and let me get back to the history of the book, it's really not that important in terms of money up until the 90s, really, the early 2000s. Like in the 70s, when these things that Ben is describing are happening, they are essentially busting people planting and harvesting marijuana, which is just...
Even in the 80s, right? I mean, everyone gets very worried about the Guadalajara cartel. You've all seen Narcos with Crazy Rafa and all this kind of stuff. They're growing weed, right? I mean, they're doing what you can walk, over 200 meters and go and buy, right? I mean, that's what they're doing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not,
And even in that case, they are causing violence because they are keeping marijuana illegal. So that was the story up until the 80s. Then the 90s come, and then the book describes this massive shift in policy, but also in the Mexican and the US economy. And then the business, the drug business, becomes a different monster, right? Now is when we see criminal organizations becoming really powerful, and the violence really that we associate with Mexico only comes out in the last 20 years or so. So the history of the drug trail, for the most part, is not a history of intrinsic and massive violence, but it is only recently, because there is a shift in the U.S. policy, but also in the Mexican and the U.S. Economy, that makes things more, let's say, easier for these criminal organizations to flourish. So can you explain a little bit about that shift that happens in the 80s, 90s, and then explodes in the 2000s?
I mean, I think the most basic fact of the matter is cocaine changes everything, right? And Mexico's always trafficked cocaine, small amounts, for basically every kilo you transport over the border for the Colombians or Bolivians or Peruvians, you get, I don't know, like $1,000, right? In the 1990s, the Americans start extraditing the Colombians. And as a result, the Colombians said, we don't want to take the risk to take the stuff into America. So as a result, we'll give you can take the risk, but we will start to pay you way more to traffic that coke across, right? So instead of paying them, I think it was average about $1,000 a kilo, they instead pay them a kilo of cocaine per kilo. Now, a kilo of cocaine, even if you sell it wholesale in the US, is not 1,000, it's 25,000. So it timeses the Mexican drug earnings by at least 25,000. Some Mexican drug traffickers start to distribute on the street, put it up into crack. You can make 250,000, right? This is also, frankly, America's cocaine boom. And I have to admit, I probably shouldn't stand here. I mean, it is now the UK, I found out, was the second highest per capita taker of cocaine in the world. But at that time, you had the crown. 70% of the world's coke was going through the going into the United States. It was quite remarkable. So you've got this huge boom, which basically gives organized crime groups that were up to that point basically subservient or subject to the state. It gives them power, it gives them money, and also it gives them guns, right? And they go and basically create their own. They basically create their own protection rackets. So instead of the cops saying to the local trafficker, right, you bring your drugs through here, you're going to pay me, suddenly it's the organized criminals doing that. It's the organized criminals, and the amazing stuff. I've just been talking to this DEA guy, or this guy who works down in San Diego. He was saying that they got into the Arellano Felix cartel's radio system in the late 90s, and they said it was literally they just borrowed the police system of controlling Tijuana. So they would go like, yeah, we got this car coming through, or this truck coming through, it's got Sinaloa plates, it might have drugs coming through it. So they would go, so this was the cartel members, not the police, were going, and then the cartel members would then phone up the police and go, have you heard of this? And the police would go, oh yeah, no, we think that might be linked to a drug deal. And they go, okay, cool. They would then stop, the cartel would stop the independent drug smugglers, kidnap them, shake them down for money, kill them if they didn't give them any money, take the drugs. So it was the organized criminals who were basically, by the late 90s, working as the state, effectively. So that was my kind of revelation. Like, where did the cartels basically emerge from the state?
And then can you tell a little bit about how Mexico became the major smuggler, if you will, of cocaine, because the market was actually located in Peru, Colombia, and then how the U.S. policy cracked down on that trade, and then Mexico became what it became.
It's a kind of push-pull factor. So the 1K, all the coke used to come in through Florida, right? If anyone's ever been to Miami, I mean, that is a city that is built on drug money, effectively, right? Like San Diego now. I voiced this to the DEA. He wasn't pleased. So it was all coming in through there. Mid 1980s, they basically have a huge crackdown. They stop it coming through the Caribbean. So late 1980s, it's coming. They're making links to these Mexicans, but what really, and you get these kind of extraordinary stories. Early 1990s of this guy Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the Lord of the Skies, using 747s to bring entirely replete with coke, right? Flying them over the kind of Chihuahua desert. It's kind of overstated. You never actually own that many planes. But what really changes it all is NAFTA. Because NAFTA, you suddenly, now there's lots of conspiracy theories about this. I don't really want to go into the kind of neoliberalism caused everything. Neoliberalism puts a lot of people out of jobs and makes a lot of people poor. They then move into the drug trade. That, I think, that's structural. Those structural reasons are there. But what's the key thing is you have way more trade through the border, right? So in 1995, they worked out that, what was it, 18 million trucks would go from Mexico into the US every year. You needed 13 trucks to get all the coke, all that 70% of the world coke, into the US, right? It's not like finding a needle in a haystack. It's finding like a bit of hay in a haystack, right? Now think what fentanyl is. Now 50 million trucks, and it takes about half a truck to get all the fentanyl that America wants. It's completely impossible. It's just pointless, basically.
So now we're getting into the 2000s, the early 2000s, and then of course the Calderon launches this war on criminal organizations. And then can you explain briefly, if you can, what is the difference between the drug trade in the 2000s compared to the early days when there were few criminal organizations, they were not as wealthy, and they were not as powerful in terms of access to weapons. So what is the difference between these recent drug trade and the early days?
Well, I think we're still living in a paradigm from the kind of early 2000s where there are these big cartels and fighting out. There are broadly, we can discuss, I think the discussion over what is a cartel is a bit of a side issue, but there are two big organized crime institutions in Mexico, organizations, the Sinaloans and the Cartel Jalisco. They have lots of links to India, China, and Germany, where they're bringing in precursor chemicals in order to make methamphetamine and fentanyl, right? And they are transporting vast quantities of this up to the border, okay? On the other hand, there are a kind of now a constellation of, depending on how you do the counting, 50 or 400 small organized crime organizations, some of which help the Sinaloans and the Cartel Jalisco transport these drugs, right? They run a particular town, they'll help the Sinaloans get the drugs through there and maybe charge a fee for it. But a lot of them, frankly, have no idea how to cook meth, no idea how to cook fentanyl. They probably run a few trucks, but they're involved effectively in loads of other forms of organized crime, right? Extortion, kidnap, really socially very damaging forms of crime, right? One of the reasons the homicide rate, even after the cartels have stopped really fighting each other, has still gone up, is because these little groups have basically moved into other forms of crime, like, you know, whether it be kind of extortion, I think being the most important. And in extortion, you almost have two states running in parallel, right? You have the state, which charges tax, right? Charges tax and allegedly protects you. And then you have the organized criminals who are also charging you what they call extortion, derecho de piso, but it's kind of like a tax, right? Because they're protecting you as well. So, I mean, we have these extraordinary, I mean, you've probably seen the kind of videos that are coming out of, you know, cartels going into chicken processing factories and saying to the people who sell chickens in the markets, right, you're going to have to up the price of chicken by 30% because we're now charging 30% of the value of this chicken, right? I mean, it's not even illicit substances they're taxing anymore. Yeah. I mean, they have really taken almost the role of the state in some areas, which is scary.
Really. It is scary.
I mean, and I'm glad. I mean, this is difficult because there is also a very dangerous right-wing idea that Mexico is a complete failed state basket case, which can only be cured by US surgical intervention. That is obviously nonsense as well. But I think it's also difficult to deny that there are swathes of Mexico which do have a really powerful criminal presence.
So I have so many other questions, of course, but I will probably open up the floor for questions from the audience. But I have one last question, which is, so this is an incredibly appealing, but at the same time dangerous thing to research. So how did you research this book? Who did you interview? How did you get the documents? The DA archive is non-existent. So where did you find the sources to write this book?
So partly it was kind of relying on my own kind of journalistic chops, and actually some really incredibly kind and friendly journalists who are working on this, but perhaps are not necessarily that interested. I mean, probably the leading journalist on drug politics in Mexico is a fellow Brit who actually turned up in the late 90s with me, a guy called Johan Grillo, who wrote an excellent book called El Narco, which again I would recommend to read. So he was extremely helpful. Sam Quinones, who's a LA journalist around here, although I'm not sure I agree with anything he's written recently. But yeah, so helped a journalist. There were lots of kind of odd discoveries. So I discovered, for example, so I did a whole chapter on kind of, there's lots of US corruption, right? I've talked a lot about Mexican corruption because this is a Mexican seminar, but there's loads of US corruption. I think in actual fact in the 70s and early 80s on a similar scale. How did I find out about that? Because American newspapers very rarely investigate local police corruption, right? I found out American newspapers are actually much less likely to critique the local sheriff than the Mexicans, right? However, in 1976, there was a journalist in Arizona. It's not funny. He started to investigate the mafia that was connecting up to Mexican cartel members and Arizona politicians. Stuck his key in his Datsun and blew up. It was a car bomb the mafia had put there. So at that point, 40 Arizona journalists and a few others from like Chicago said, right, we're going to investigate all this corruption. And they spent a whole year basically investigating really heavy corruption of the Republican Party in Arizona, of the construction industry, of border sheriffs, acting quote unquote like the Mexicans were at the same time, i.e. shaking down drug traffickers. Everything got buried. No one, I mean, they tried to get it published in the New York Times, Chicago Tribune, nothing. They published a few articles in the Arizona Republic or something like that, and then basically all their files are now in the State Archive of Missouri, where one of the journalists ended up. So I just kind of got in touch with the State Archive of Missouri, and they're like, oh, no one's ever looked at this. And it was like so rich, like 170 boxes, including like pictures. I mean, I've got a student working, well, the student at UCL is now working on this, pictures of like Republican Party funders rolling out of drug dealers' dens in Phoenix, the New Mexico senator who was sending drugs in his yacht, was basically had a yacht down in Punta Penasco or whatever on the Sonora coast, and he was like getting it taken up by truck, and it was just full of drugs. And then he once got caught by the DEA, and he just phoned up the head of the DEA and go, "Could you stop this happening?" And the DEA were like, "Oh, okay." So yeah, I mean, that's a, you know, so that was, I suppose that was a bit of a discovery, but that was only kind of one chapter out of 20 or so, you know.
So thank you so much.
Okay,
Ben.
sorry, right.
I don't know if people have questions or.
There are some questions online. You want to open it for the room here first, and then we'll go.
Okay, yeah. First, anyone questions?
I had a question kind of like, I guess in recent years, there's been a shift in policy in states towards the legalization of marijuana. And assuming that that's a major economy for the drug cartels in Mexico, how does that affect Mexico?
Massively, and massively negatively has it affected Mexico. So previously, and this was very noticeable because I was doing this kind of research on the Mixteca down in the kind of rural Mexico, and that area by the 2010s, but lots of areas of Mexico were producing marijuana. Once you get legalization happening really from kind of 2012 onwards, it totally ruins that industry, right? Peasants cannot make money on that. So they moved to opium poppies. So by about 2014, 2015, there's lots of opium poppies in areas, you know, throughout rural Mexico. But frankly, the drop-off in marijuana profits, which some people estimate by the mid-2000s were somewhere in the region of 40% cartel profits, they just wiped them out. And a lot of cartels then got, frankly, into other forms of organized crime: sex trafficking, kidnapping, and extortion, illegal logging, illegal mining. Right, even groups that hadn't really done that before, like the Sinaloans, we now know are just as involved in extortion. They don't like to say they are, but yeah. I mean, interestingly, it was a fantastic, and I don't know if anyone follows the journalist Luis Chaparro. He's like he's really, really good journalist. I really encourage you. Fantastic guy, works out of El Paso. He was recently invited to the Sinaloans' legal marijuana lab. So Chapo's sons have decided that they're going to legalize weed in Mexico in the next couple of years. I mean, they nominally have, but they haven't really got it on the market. So they got a load of hippie Californian weed blokes down from your local whatever fields around here, brought them down to Mexico to go and try and produce it in Mexico, right? And then Luis got in enormous amounts of trouble for doing this, and that's right. There might even be a bounty on him. So you know, people do much stupider things than I do. Yeah, yeah.
Any other questions?
No, como quieres. No, está bien.
I don't know if everybody is thanks for your work and for your talk now. Thanks very much for your questions. And thanks for write about something a big problem in Mexico that we don't have all the elements to understand everything. and it's a big aportation. I want to ask you is the reactions in Mexico about your book. Recently was translated to Spanish. Almost arrived Mexico last year, and if you know,
Deafening silence. No, I mean, it was partly because it was produced in the COVID, so I mean, it was difficult to kind of get out there. I did one kind of talk, but I mean, the drug war has become incredibly depressingly, like everything has been politicized and culture warriored in Mexico, right? So if you say, I mean, just like everything has here just like the drug war actually has in the United States, if you kind of bang on about Mexico's full of drug cartels, you're against the current president, right? If you say, in actual fact, homicide rates are going down, which they kind of are, then you're a supporter of AMLO. So it's very difficult to kind of say something sensible between these two poles, and particularly as the elections are coming up. So, I mean, interestingly, I don't know, you clearly follow Mexican politics. So I'm a very good friend of Carlos Perez Ricard, who's kind of a very AMLO supporting journalist. And he was very, very much kind of supportive of my book, but now because he's an AMLO supporting or shame-bound supporting journalist, he doesn't really mention it because it's talking about incredibly profound levels of corruption and violence within the Mexican state. So as I say, it's difficult to I mean, and you know this. I mean, each news organization is taking a particular stance on AMLO, and it's difficult to kind of fit amidst these groups. I mean, you know, they have their MSNBC and they have their Fox, and you know, their versions. Right.
Well, thank you for your talk. I want to ask you about narco culture is very deep in Mexican society, from Los Tigres del Norte to Peso Pluma. But it's very difficult to talk about it. For example, when I was at Medellin, my friends don't want to link his experience with Pablo Escobar. In Medellin, it's not only narco traffic culture and cocaine, and I feel the same as a Mexican, no? I don't want to be related with cartels Nueva Generación, and I know it's not only, as you say, the traffic of the drugs. It's a lot of violence and kidnapping and a lot of things. For example, in Mexico City, if you have a business, you have to pay derecho de piso. But doesn't matter if your business is a restaurant, a hair salon. For example, in my neighborhood, my friends told me that they have these calls when so give me your money and you have to pay. But what do you think that now, a few days ago, Peso Pluma was the headline of Coachella? It's the first Mexican that ever closed a festival like Coachella. So it's not white or black, no? It's very complex. But what is your feeling and what do you think about the young people now seems to be, well, I don't know, like to be related with that kind of values?
Well, I'm not sure that I would necessarily. I mean, I think I mean, the clear line to draw here, and I'm no kind of cultural expert, is between is hip hop, right? In a similar way talks about life on the street. I suppose where you talk about Peso Pluma, there is, and I'm not sure how much people, there is a direct link between Peso Pluma, right, and drug cartel. His grandfather was a guy called El Culichi, who was a hitman for the Sinaloans, died in a shoot. Weirdly, talking to a policeman who was there 2 days ago. In 1984, he was shot in a party where all the big drug traffickers like Caro Quintero and Don Neto were at. And then the drug traffickers tracked down the person who killed him and murdered him in an incredibly gruesome way. So, I mean, Culichi was, I mean, Peso Pluma is part of the Elenes family, and the Elenes family are from Badiraguato. I mean, they're you know, they've been drug traffickers for 4 or 5 generations. Does that necessarily mean that he doesn't make extraordinary? I mean, he's amazing. I mean, I don't think he's as good as Nathaniel Cano, who I think is a much smarter. Does that make me sound probably massive? No, Nathaniel. It's like when I pronounce K-pop bands with my daughter. I mean, I find this really difficult. I mean, I'm sure you've watched the video for like Bellicon, right? I mean, that was his kind of standout first ever track. I mean, that's very obviously about the Culiacanazo, right? And he's very much posing with kind of narco culture in a way that even kind of weird niche nerds like me, like, do you ever see, if you pull up the Bellicon thing, he's pretending to strum this kind of bat. Do you ever see that? It's really weird, like a bat with 2 holes, like it's a piece of wood like that with 2 holes in it. You're like, why is that weird Mexican instrument? It's not. It's the bat that narcos use to basically punish people who infringe on justice in a village. So if you rob something or violate a woman, you get beaten with that bat. So you've got Peso Pluma kind of giving a nod to kind of niche narco village culture. It's very odd, right? On the other hand, you know, he can also be on whatever, he was on that Saturday Night Live or whatever. He was singing his Así Baila, you know, which is just a love song, really. That's not narco at all. It's just a good, you know, banging tune, really. I mean, so I realize it is very difficult. My wife doesn't like it at all, probably like you, has kind of grown up, fears the violence, is sufficiently close to it to see it as being deeply unpleasant, right? And I mean, she won't talk about it. She's actually read my other books. I mean, you know, she won't read this one. She won't talk about it. Her family don't want to talk about it. You know, I mean, they're very, for exactly the same reasons, right? I mean, they're kind of half terrified, half find it kind of grotesque, and are ashamed that it's become linked with a country that, as I say, I fell in love with in the late 90s when it was all about democracy, cool cinema, and Zapatistas. I mean, so they're, you know, and that's what I kind of fell in love with. So they're, so yeah, I mean, so I haven't really given an answer. It is incredibly kind of, yeah, complex, but doesn't mean that it's not good to listen to.
May I add something? That's why you have to read the book, really, because the book, it's divided in 4 parts, 5 parts. Only the last part, it's about the current violence in Mexico. The rest of the book is just explaining how politics and policies work between 2 countries. And it is not necessarily related to dysfunctionality or a failed state. It's the history of how we get into this mess, really. So one way to start sort of countering the stereotypical images that now Mexicans, as Colombia back in the past, back in the 90s, were associated with, is by reading this type of literature. It's research that it's serious, and it tells you the story of the drug trail without necessarily being overly dramatic about it. It's giving you the tools so you can place the current violence in historical context, and then you can, of course, understand that Mexico is not necessarily the country that the mainstream media paint in current.
But I mean, I will say that this has been difficult when promoting the book, because there are people. So there are obviously like kind of well-meaning kind of conferences like this where I go and talk to people who are like smart and know a bit, and but then I get also invited in quite right-wing shows that just basically want me to go, it's a fucking nightmare down there. It's full of cartels, you know, and I'm quite resistant to doing that. I'm not a journalist. I don't rely on that for my money, but I talk to journalists who are doing this kind of stuff, who are incredibly intelligent, do understand it's got very deep roots, it's really complex, it's linked to the state. And yet they're, you know, they're YouTube clipped or TikTok clipped into 3-minute soundbite where they go, oh my God, it's terrifying, you know. So and that's the portrayal that most people are getting of Mexico. So even you're right in saying you can be well-meaning, but you also risk, by talking about this, portraying Mexico in a way that it should not be portrayed. And I'm now following this up with the kind of thing, a book which is looking at the last 30 years. And I'm really wondering how the hell you write that in a way that isn't simply kind of fodder for, how can you do that with love, right? It's difficult.
Yeah. So let me move to some questions online.
Okay, sorry.
Because there are many questions, and people are really appreciating your presentation. A two-part question from Carol Browner. One, she says, I've heard that Felipe Calderon made the war on drugs much worse. What do you think about that? And tied to that is, with the upcoming presidential elections in Mexico, do you see any possibility for a better drug policy? Or is the country truly captive to US in these regards?
That's two really good questions. The first one is yes, undeniable. Two things to point out. One, the fights between cartels were going on pre-Calderon. This is what I think a lot of people do miss out. There were no doubt tensions between these cartels, 2004, 2005, actually going back, frankly, to the 1990s. But very bloody confrontations were happening. And I remember, and if you were doing your research in 2004, 2005, yeah, right. So, and I remember trying to get up from like Mexico City up to Texas, and you couldn't go through Nuevo Laredo, like 2004. They were like, they've just killed two policemen and 2 police chiefs in a row or something. And I just remember not being you know, so that was happening. Having said all that, yes, Calderon basically poured petrol onto the fire, broke up these larger organizations, sent the military in, who, as I said, had kind of shoot to kill policies. He made it way worse. Pushed them, as I say, by disintegrating these kind of bigger cartels, pushed these groups kind of to get involved in other forms of organized crime because they didn't have the links to these smaller groups, didn't have the links to the Colombians or the Chinese or people they needed to make drugs. So yeah, no doubt, perhaps not intentionally. I'm not a person who buys the idea that Calderon was, I'm not an Anabel Hernandez who buys the idea that Calderon is some super corrupt mastermind. I think he was one of these, and I kind of studied them for my second book, one of these kind of slightly self-righteous, nerdy panistas who thinks that Mexico is corrupt, and as long as we clean the corruption, we can become like the United States. And so that's how I kind of read him. I think he was, you know, well-ish intentioned, if you think that, although highly classist, I would say. Yeah, and so that's that. And in terms of the current election, they're going to do anything. I mean, I think weed will be legal. I think one thing that Mexico really has to do that no one seems to talk about at all is it has a massive problem with its own drug addiction now. Huge, right? Now going through the drug rehab centers, it was just for 30, 40 years, it's been weed. It's now more people are taking meth than weed in Mexico, or at least been seeing for meth than for weed. I mean, it's got a real problem with narcotics that no one will talk about. And a lot of the deaths that are being caused are basically just street fights over who's selling crappy amounts of meth to small captive addict populations. And the poor people who are kind of working on harm reduction and kind of strategies, and they don't even know, what's the one that you said, narco, right? They don't even have that in, like, they don't have that in Tijuana, right? There are private narco providers. There's no kind of state. The police don't have it, so you find a person dead. So there's basically, they're not even counting the people who die. So there's an amazing investigation done by the judge or the procurador, the attorney general in Mexicali on the border. And he was like, I'm pretty sure we've got some really bad drugs going around. So he goes, right, I'm actually going to blood test everyone who comes into the morgue. And he found out 30% had fentanyl in their blood. Right? But apparently drug overdose is 0 in Mexicali. So that's something I think that's something that Mexico can do, but it involves large amounts of money being put into the health service and into psychological services. And I'm trying to think what second richest city in the United States. It's not going that well here. So that's pretty depressing. Sorry.
Sorry, it's a lot.
No, go on.
So recently with the mass incarceration in Salvador, how has that affected the markets of the drug industry? Like similar to how Colombians reacted to the extradition of drug dealers, and how has that affected the relationship between the U.S. agencies and Mexico? I mean, Mexico and El Salvador, because I'm thinking like, do they have a similar relationship as like DEA and FBI with Mexico? And also, how has that changed the strategy of the cartels?
Wow, that is a big question. I mean, in terms of, so you're talking, I mean, one thing that mass incarceration has done is just like it did with the El Salvadorans. I mean, you have a lot of now former gang members, Mexican drug sellers who are doing prison time, are getting out of prison and are being sent back to Mexico because they weren't born in the United States. Now, one thing that I found out, and I work a lot with these people when they're trying to get asylum. So I work quite a lot with Mexican asylum seekers who go, you know, I never lived in Mexico. I'm covered in tattoos. If I go back over the border, they're going to grab me, and they're either going to try and recruit me or they're going to try and extort me. And one thing that I found that was really scary recently was the Americans have this policy called CHIS. Weird name, if you know Spanish, hilarious name. It's called the Criminal History Information Sharing Program. So if a Mexican has done a crime in, let's say, Los Angeles, right, is a member of the Norteños or Sureños or Mexican mafia, right, and he is deported back down to Mexico, the Americans give all his prison information, including if he was an informant, to the Mexican authorities. Now, to me, that's a fucking death list, right? And they're doing this. They're incredibly. The American government, as soon as I said this in an asylum case, the Department of Homeland Security created a 100-page document about me, including reading my books. They did. Maybe Fernando was working for them. They read my books, read all my tweets, were like finding if I was like rude about, you know, DHS or Border Patrol. So I'm incredibly careful about that kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, to me, that is deeply dangerous. Now, their excuse, I think, is somewhat justified. It was like, okay, we don't want to just send a load of gang members down to Mexico like we did in El Salvador in the late 80s, early 90s, right? But at the same time, we found that there's an extraordinary leak of military information called the Guacamaya leak, Sedena leaks. Basically, they leaked all the military's emails because it's got such an efficient internet service. But I found out that a lot of this information, the Americans are sending that information to the military. Now, the military is not the most closed, uncorrupt of institutions, right? So I'm guessing it's selling it to the cartels. We've got this informant coming down. He's going to be in the deportation processing center. I mean, I talked to a former guy, Sinaloa cartel guy, and he said that it was his job to buy informants and people who had lost loads in the deportation processing centers. That was his job. Like the government said, we got this informant. He's, you know, he went and lost a load for the Sinaloa cartel. Come and pick him up. And this guy would just go there and then hand him over, and he would be killed.
So would you say it's like a transfer of power more so from the cartels to like more corruption in the government?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's definitely a big part of it. Yeah, I mean, you know, well, I mean, in many of these areas, the line between the government and the cartels is just not. There is no stable line, right? I mean, I don't know. Place I've been recently in Juarez, right? The Juarez we know it as the Juarez cartel. In Juarez, they know it as La Línea, and La Línea is the name for the police because the two were the same, right? There was no. They were just exactly the same. Yeah. No, it's fine. Can we have a light question?
About one about corridos?
Yes, come on.
Okay.
Right, okay, good.
Could you discuss how the corrido genre especially relates to the drug trade in the Mexican borderlands? Do corridos on their own convey cultural nuances related to Mexico? The borderlands and drug trade?
That's a difficult one. Right, okay. I mean, I have to confess I'm an unbelievably mechanical reader and listener of corridos. They're basically just kind of the stories the newspapers don't sell. I know this is deeply unfashionable and unsophisticated, but I mean, certainly the ones that I listen to, they normally kind of touch on the truth. There's a really good guy, Ramirez Pimiento, who's written really good stuff about the first ever drug corridos in the 20s and 30s. So the first big drug corridos, one's about a guy called Pablote, who was like wife of a woman called La Nacha, big heroin trafficker. Another one called Corrido del Hampa, the corrido of the underworld. And you know, if you read the lyric, listen to the thing, it's literally just telling you a story that they just nabbed off the newspapers, and the newspapers nabbed it off the cops who did did this stuff, right? I mean, these are, and even today, I mean, a friend of mine just did a documentary about Chalino Sanchez, right? The king, the Elvis of, or the Bob Dylan of corridos. I mean, when I kind of go back and listen to his stuff, and now knowing a lot of stuff that was happening in the late 80s and 90s, it's amazing. I was like, shit, Chalino wrote an actual corrido about this. There's a guy I was looking into that no one knows anything about. His name's Rigoberto Campos. I think he's the first guy the Tijuana cartel kind of kill for not paying them to take drugs through the area. And this is in 1991. And I found out that, oh, shit, Chalino has an incredibly dark corrido about him, which involves, I think the cartel tried to kill him. They kidnapped him, put his hands through a combine harvester. So he had prosthetic arms. But he survived that somehow. And then they shot him in the car. So the corrido by Chalino Sanchez goes, even though he has prosthetic arms, the cartel still managed to take him out. So, and that, as I say, I've looked at the judicial documents on that. That's kind of what happened. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know. As I say, I'm not talking about great cultural nuance, but I do think they are stories that newspapers don't tend to tell, right? That would be my pathetically unsophisticated reading of them.
I have a question. Do you believe that Mexico is a narco state? And the second one is to exist that the trade traffic, we need two factors, the offer and the demand. So what do you think about this dynamic?
That's a really good question. I mean, the narco state question, I'm very dubious about calling it that way because, frankly, it's been taken up by people who want to do real damage to Mexico, right? Both financial and, I suspect, military damage, right? So I'm really dubious about that. Having said that, I do, there were people who I really admire, a guy called El Búho, who was a very kind of left-wing 68er. I mean, he was calling Mexico a narco state under Salinas in the 1990s, right? I mean, there were no doubts. So speaking to an academic audience, I would say there are no doubt that bits of the Mexican state have been captured by organized crime. But where I would say, not all of it, like there are a whole section. Mexico functions as a country, right? I mean, it does actually, it's in the OECD, it has water, electricity. I mean, things work in Mexico. It's not like going to Somalia, right? So it's not a failed state in any way, shape, or form. But you are right, bits of it have been captured by organized crime. Also, there are areas of Mexico that are much more captured than other areas, right? I mean, we're lucky enough we'll go to tourist areas. I mean, tourist areas are not touched by it. And they're not, organized crime has clearly made some kind of pact with the local governors or the local mayors not to touch this place. Like Puerto Vallarta, Oaxaca, where my wife comes from, these places are almost entirely clean of it. And as soon as organized crime does go near these places, they get taken out pretty quickly. Sorry, and your second question was about demand. Sorry.
Yes, it's about the dynamic between the offer and the demand. Because so Mexico offer the group.
This is
Who is
who's,
the consumer?
yeah.
And also, what about the US selling guns to the traffickers in Mexico?
Yeah, those are
It's
two.
kind of the
You're putting,
business.
yeah, you're putting your dedo in La Llaga, right? So the first thing is that just as Mexican drugs are killing Americans, American guns are killing Mexicans, right? I mean, the amount of vast majority of cartel guns. I mean, there's an extraordinary PhD that was done by a guy called David Perez, now in the government there actually, and is part of this movement to get to bring legal cases against the gun companies in the United States. And he did this extraordinary PhD where he went and interviewed hitmen in Juarez, and they were saying, yeah, it was 2003. We didn't have a fucking gun, right? I had a machete. The boss had some crappy Central American AK, 47. Suddenly, 2004, America changes its laws, allows the sale of semi-automatics. Gun companies quite deliberately realize there is a massive market in Mexico, move loads of gun shops move down there, and by 2004, all the cartels are basically buying up weapons en masse, right? So there is and these extraordinary graphs where he could basically plot, 2005 gun sales in El Paso go through the roof. 2006, massive bloodshed in Juarez. There's a direct correlation, right? And it's not geographically incredibly close. So I think that's really key. In terms of demand, this is a real controversy, and I talked about this guy. There's a guy called Sam Quinones who's written 2 books that you might have heard of. One called The Least of Us, one called Dreamland. He's a LA-based journalist. Least of Us, the big argument he has is, okay, he thinks that it's not actually about US demand, right? He thinks it's not really about US demand for meth and fentanyl. He thinks that in actual fact, what is happening is the Mexican drug cartels are acting, and the parallel he gives is like Pfizer or the Sacklers or Purdue, and are quite deliberately marketing palatable, if very dangerous drugs in pill form to the Americans. Now, I think this is a really dangerous argument to say, because then you're saying it's not really it's not the Mexicans' fault. They're not the Americans. The Americans don't have to clear up homelessness, lack of medical care, lack of psychological care. The Mexicans have to stop fentanyl, which is, as I put out, kind of basically impossible. But I think this is the new argument. Are fentanyl and meth new kinds of drugs? Are the cartels now kind of marketing savvy? Are they pushing this on a kind of unwilling United States, or is it actually US demand that is driving this? I think it's a really complex question. I'm not sure I have an answer for. So yeah, no, really, as I say, you've got your dead on firmly into La Llaga there. So thanks.
Any other questions before we close? Vivian?
Yes. Hi. I had the pleasure of reading your book last year.
You still turned up, right? Okay, right.
It was great. And while reading it, I was wondering specifically in that last part where you talk about the last 20, 50 years, the connections between organized crime and violence against women. So I was wondering if you could talk more about that.
Yes, it's something. Yeah, I mean, Mexico has had a problem since the 1990s with what they class as femicides. That is the murder of women for the sake of being women, right? Rather than simply just beef over something, beef over robbery or something like that. How is that linked necessarily to organized crime? Well, one way it is linked to organized crime is there is no justice for this woman, right? The organized crime has basically corrupted the entire judicial system. I mean, if we're talking about where Mexico is a narco state, it is the judicial system, where you have 98% of violent crimes are still not prosecuted. The people who do get prosecuted, I mean, they're never the real people who actually do the murders. And this is particularly so Mexican organized crime has basically opened the justice system to complete corruption, thus meaning that it's impossible to prosecute even, people who are unconnected to organized crime, who, let's say, kill their wife or kill their girlfriend. At the same time, I mean, there was that extraordinary case, horrible case, the 3 deaths of Maria Escobedo. It's a very good documentary. And I mean, that guy who killed his girlfriend, I mean, he was quite obviously protected by organized crime. And he was a fairly low-level guy. I mean, the guy wasn't Chapo or something. I mean, he was but again, you see the complete corruption of the justice system, which is something linked to organized crime, link between organized crime and the state. The other thing I would say is, okay, if you think the vast majority of the kind of foot soldiers of the cartels, the so-called stats out now, 175,000 people they now estimate kind of work at some level for the cartel. I don't know how they get these figures, I don't know, kind of bullshit. But anyway, lots of young men work for the cartels. These are basically the precariat, the people who don't have, working half in the informal economy. These are people who have lost their sense of kind of masculinity, or kind of basically they would have previously maybe worked in factories or field, provided for their family. It is this upsetting of traditional patriarchal roles that I suspect is connected not only to their involvement in the cartels, but also connected to violence against women. Not that this is an excuse or anything, but I think there are these large structural changes that happened to Mexican men over the last 20, 30 years. And one effect has been a lot of them are joined organized crime, because frankly, if you get a gun, it's better than, you know, selling tacos on the street. It gives you more of a sense of yourself, but also has been violence against women. So there is that kind of connection. There's a really good book, if you're interested in this, I'm not sure you've given this, Where I Wear My Alligator Boots, by a anthropologist who kind of looked into the link between organized crime, corridos, and masculinity, and did it in a really clever way that I'm not explaining terribly well. She's much better. Except I can't pronounce her name, it's very long. Wellman or something.